Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all well, and I know you've taken some time out to be with us this evening. It's great to have so many people on our webinar. Welcome to our webinar, A Night with Professor David Olusoga. I'm Rosie Peters, co-head of school at Wendell Park Primary, and co-presenting with me this evening is Kate Kern, the Learning and Engagement Manager from Fulham Palace Trust. This evening, we're exploring why representation and inclusive history matters. The Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham is committed to bringing greater diversity and inclusion and ensuring that all employees feel celebrated and represented, that students and teachers in every school see themselves within the curriculum and have that sense of belonging. Over the last year, since forming the Power of Representation, a borough grassroots organisation, we've delivered a number of events and initiatives. These have included webinars where individuals have shared lived experiences, where data from the Office of National Statistics have provided factual evidence of inequalities that exist for our Black community and other marginalised groups. Schools have been introduced to the Guardian Black Timeline created by Gavern Bennett, the Heritage Officer for Hammersmith and Fulham. On the 6th of October, schools across the borough held a brilliant Black History drop-down day to signal the start of Black History 365, the aim being to make Black history part of mainstream history. We have launched 3 local Black History trails, spotlighting the rich history of prominent Black individuals who've lived and contributed to a local area for centuries. We've created a portal where teachers can access resources to support them in teaching Black history, as well as increase their knowledge and professional development. The playwright, novelist and broadcaster, Bonnie Greer, talked at our September webinar and visited our local schools, one of our local schools. We are working closely in partnership with different organisations, for example, Fulham Palace, which is looking at the Bishop of London, colonialism, and the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans as part of an ongoing project. This year, they're working with researchers to uncover more diverse stories, as well as collaborating with local schools and community groups to find ways to better tell those stories at the Palace. In addition, the Palace is currently working with spoken word artist Adisa to explore themes of hidden resistance with local groups. An exhibition of this work will open in the new year, so we'll hope you'll be able to attend some of those exhibitions. We have Hammersmith and Fulham's Black History 365 project, which is led by Peter Parkin and his team. Peter has been instrumental in spotlighting Black British history and the fact that Black people have been present in the UK for centuries. He has done this through high quality talks and events, not just in the month of October, but throughout the year. We're also working very closely with the National Gallery, the Science Museum, local organisations such as the Lyric Theatre and Riverside Studios in Hammersmith, and of course the British Museum. Basically what we want to do is to ensure that people from different communities feel that they have a right to visit these spaces and they feel that they belong in these spaces. We had the pleasure of hosting a brilliant and informative discussion with Professor David Olusoga in March, and I'm delighted that David is back with us this evening. Many of you will know of his work as a historian through his TV programmes, for example, Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners, A House Through Time, and My Civilizations, and his numerous books, including his children's book, Black and British, A Short Essential History. David is relentless in seeking and revealing the hidden chapters of the past, and in doing so is bringing together the missing pieces of British history. This supports the transition needed in order for us to move away from the separate narrative of Black British history so that it becomes part of mainstream British history. With that said, I am delighted and privileged to introduce to you this evening Professor David Olusoga. Welcome, David.
Well, it's good to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much for being here this evening. We're all really excited to have you here. I'm going to launch straight into my questions, So my first question for you this evening is, what inspires you about local history research, and how can people get involved in finding out about their local history, particularly the untold stories?
Oh, well, thank you for that question. I think one of the kind of most fundamental realities about history that people sometimes forget is that all history is local history. All history takes place somewhere. There is a local dimension to absolutely everything. I think when it comes to Black history in particular, it's particularly important because of all the forms of history that I work in, and I work in urban history, I work in history of race and empire, I write about the First World War. Of all of the areas I work in, Black history is the one where local historians have been absolutely pivotal. They've been central because this history that we now have, these Black figures from the past, these missing chapters that have, as you said, have become a separate narrative, they've often been recovered by local historians. It was local historians who managed to piece together this patchwork of all these missing people, all these missing chapters, and give us a really important role in giving us the history we have today. But I think what's happened over the past, I think probably about 15, 20 years is, I think makes local history even more important because there's been an absolute revolution. It's been made possible largely by the internet, and it's a revolution in participatory history. I mean, one of the most financially lucrative, one of the most popular, one of the most engaged areas of activity on the internet is genealogy. The revolution in genealogy has been an absolute revolution in history because it's brought people into history who are actually doing history. It was not long ago that the only people who actually engaged with documents, actually went to archives, whether physically or virtually, were people who were historians, usually academics or people researching books or people engaged in specialist commissioned research. Well, now millions of people, I mean, literally millions of people are engaged in the activity, the process of creating histories, family histories. And it's not really stopped there. The series I make, A House Through Time, that you mentioned a moment ago, that's part of another, and in some ways it's a sort of shop window of another form of participatory history, which has taken just grasped the imagination of hundreds of thousands, well, millions of people, which is histories of homes. And what's happening is many people who've done that genealogical journey, who've encountered their ancestors, who've got used to the idea that there are stories to be told, there are people to be encountered, there are emotions to be felt through documents, through the archive. The next venture that they embark upon is the history of their homes, an extraordinarily personal journey because our homes are the most personal places to us. They're the places where we really are ourselves. And the fact that they come to us secondhand, they come to us with their own history, and that history is the history of other people's with whom we shared this shared space, this intimate space. Millions of people are engaged in that. As a historian, as a public historian who makes television programs, the proudest aspect of my career is the fact that after every series of House Through Time, archivists write to us to say that there's been an increase in footfall in the archives of people doing that local history, the investigations into their homes. I've just been making a television series, producing rather than presenting, a television series which is just finishing on E4 next week, called Museum of Us. And that is, once again, it's people, communities being brought together with the help of experts and a bit of TV magic to tell the history of their streets. And again, it's hyper-local history. It's participatory history. It's not something that's given to you by somebody in a university or somebody on television. It's something that you're absolutely engaged in. So local history is the most participatory. It's the most grassroots form of history, but it's also the form of history that more people are engaged in than any other. And that fear that we used to presume, we in television used to presume people had about documents, that's been thrown out the window. When I first began as a TV producer, whenever I was making programs and they involved documents, my bosses did everything they could to stop me referring to documents. Whenever I mentioned documents, they would append the word with a pejorative. Dry, dusty, old, boring. Documents were always one of those things. No one does that now because people understand that local history, participatory history, history that they engage with themselves rather than have delivered to them by an expert, that is where the passion is. That's where the energy and the engagement is with history. In some ways, that is where more people are encountering history than anywhere else.
And it's so important, I agree, that we know our history. And I think starting with a local history is so important. I've seen that with the school children, with the 3 trails that we've set up. And it's making a massive impact, a big difference. And it's just getting them to know about themselves, know their history, not just their own history, but the history of the other communities around them as well. Thank you very much for that response. My second question to you is, how can teachers and parents support the teaching of Black history in schools? And what support do you think the education system, museums and archives can give them?
Well, I have to begin that response to that by, I think, stating something very negative, which is I don't think that support is going to come from our political leaders. I don't actually think this is a moment in our history where we can look to our leaders for this thing called leadership. The curriculum, the creation of lessons and examinations that expand what is taught in history, that make history relevant to a population that is already 14% non-white, scheduled, according to one estimate, England and Wales, to be 30% non-white by the middle of the century. The creation of a curriculum fit for purpose, fit for the nation that we are now, never mind the nation that we're going to be in 30 years' time, that is not something that our politicians are actively and in any sort of mature and professional sense engaged with. Rather, there are many of them engaged with playing culture war games with this history. And I think that needs to be said, because we're not going to have allyship from the political class on this issue. And I think it's difficult for politicians of any party, once something has been made into a culture war toy, for them to address it. So I think we need to discount, I hope I'm wrong and I'd love to be proved wrong, discount help from political leadership on this issue. But I think there's, to be more optimistic, I think there's an awful lot that can be done and has been done. And sometimes the statistics we use disguise progress and could make us sort of more depressed than we should be. The official statistic in terms of examinations paint a bleak picture. There's 59 GCSE history examinations in this country offered by the 3 big exam boards, the exams most children do. And of those, around 11-12% have any Black history. And very often the Black history they have on offer is African-American history. Now, of course, African-American history from 1619, in terms of Black history, from the first arrival of Africans in Virginia, the British colony, right up to the Revolution in the 1770s, well, that is British history, but it's not really taught as British history. We're much more interested traditionally in that period in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, leading up to the Civil War, the great cotton expansion of the Deep South. So around 11-12% of students studying GCSE history as their examinations encounter any form of Black history. But as I said, that picture is not quite as bleak as it seems. It's not partly bleak because most schools now are academies. And academies have far more liberty to go off curriculum than schools under local authority control. But it's also more optimistic because we know, thanks to a study carried out last year, or was it last year by the Royal Historical Society, that this generation of young teachers are going off curriculum. They're using the freedoms if they're in academies, and they're using things like Black History Month if they're not in academies, in order to teach not a curriculum, but lessons that are far, far more diverse and far more inclusive than the curriculum demands and that the examination system demands. The statistics and the figures in the Royal Historical Society report is far, far more encouraging. There's still a long way to go. There's still black spots. There are still differences between the 4 nations. So it's better than you would think if you looked at those statistics. And of course, I mentioned the 4 nations. Now, Wales made the fantastic decision this year to properly incorporate Black history into their curriculums officially. So this sort of unofficial rearguard action that we're having to do in England, well, Wales now do have support from their political leadership. And I think that's that's a great sign. And I hope that the rest of the 4 nations follow the lead of Wales on this. But I think there's other reasons to be optimistic. Teachers now have more assistance, and they're going to be given more assistance than I think ever before. One of two of the industries that I think have profoundly failed on creating a history ecosystem that is diverse and inclusive are the publishing industry and the educational publishing industries. And I know in both of those cases, because I'm engaged in both of those industries, involved in both of those sectors, there is a flurry of new work, new publications coming. Of all the sectors that I'm involved in, I work in television, I work in academia, I sit on boards, but I also write books, and I'm involved in publishing. Of all the sectors, publishing is the one that I think looked most rigorously at itself in the mirror in 2020. I think publishing, I'm sad to say, more than television and more than many other sectors, had a moment of recognition of its failings. And I think its failings are extreme during the summer of 2020. Publishing does not reflect, both in terms of whose stories get told, whose books gets published, and who gets to choose which books gets published and whose stories get told. It doesn't reflect Britain at all. It is enormously skewed towards upper middle class people. It's enormously skewed toward a huge metropolitan bias. And in terms of racial diversity, it has profoundly failed. It's done far better on gender. It's a very female industry in some ways, but when it comes, but those women aren't black women or brown women. Publishing is in a process of trying to rebalance, trying to recognize, I think, the scale of its historic failings. And as a result, there is coming a barrage of new books, both for children and for adults, published by Black writers, many of whom should have got their first book contract 10 years ago, 5 years ago. I'm sad that they didn't get them when they needed them, when they needed them for their career, but I'm glad that they're getting those contracts now. But what that means for us, those of us who are reading, those of us who are involved in education, is that we're going to have more resources. Something similar is happening in the world of educational resources, lesson plans, children's textbooks. Again, those industries failed. Again, those industries have not reflected, both in their output and in their makeup, the diversity of the United Kingdom. And again, that industry, I'm not quite sure to the same extent as trade publishing, is engaged in trying to make amends. I've just finished a series of lesson plans with my older sister, who's Professor of Education. I'm doing more in the future. So teachers have allies now in the form of resources being produced by industries that have traditionally failed. They also have allies in parents. I think I meet more and more parents who are not willing to stand for the curriculum, for the gaps in the curriculum that perhaps we did before 2020. Perhaps we felt we couldn't combat. Teachers have parents on their side. This generation of young teachers, and of course, young teachers are part of a generation that is, strident on these issues. They have allies. They have more resources than ever. It seems to me that very often a sort of presumption that the problem here is teachers. The problem here is teachers haven't had support. I mean, again, we can see that through the statistics in the Royal Historical Society. The most troubling statistic, the one that we should take to heart most seriously, I think, in that research, is that only 12% of teachers feel confident teaching Black British history. And that number needs to radically improve. Now, there's two ways that number could improve. It could improve through better training, better resources, but it could also improve with diversity within the teaching industry as well. Because of all these industries that have failed teaching as well, it doesn't represent the diversity of the United Kingdom. There are teachers who haven't got colleagues who are people of colour, and don't have the sense of strength from those interpersonal relationships. In some ways, we are paying for the earlier failings and the half-hearted initiatives of recent decades. I think the period after 2020, between then and now, has been one of those periods when the history's fast-forward button has been pressed. We want change, and we want it faster than ever. People are willing to demand change than ever. But the resources, and sometimes the career progression, hasn't been there because of failures in earlier decades. So there's a lot to be done, but I think there's more people engaged in doing it. There's more resources to enable people to do it better. There's confidence that can be built. So it's a mixed picture. As I said, I was sad to say there's no leadership coming from our leaders, but there is, I think, a strong sense that things have to change. And I meet a lot of young teachers, men and women in their 20s and early 30s, who are not going to rest on this, who are not really willing to stand for teaching a curriculum that doesn't reflect the realities, the demographic realities of the classes that they teach. And, to be a teacher is to spend your professional life gazing 20 years into the future. If you want to know what Britain looks like in 20 years' time, go to an infant school in Birmingham or Liverpool or London or Bristol. the projections, the statistics that you can read in newspapers, and people like me can say on events like this, teachers see that literally every day of their working life, and they look at the diversity of these classrooms, and they look at this curriculum which feels like it was more fitted for the 1950s rather than the 2020s, and they reject it. And they are finding every device, every confection they can to teach classes and teach lessons that actually include the family stories and the family histories of the children in front of them. And I think it's for a very, very clear and I think very moral reason, is without these histories, these shared histories, we can't make sense of our society, and to an extent, and in a way, we can't really know each other. I always think it's very, very striking to remember the 492 people who got off the Windrush in 1948. They didn't know any of the history of the presence of Black people in Britain. They might have had relatives who lived in Liverpool in between the wars. They might have known a little bit, but they didn't know about the Black Georgians. They didn't know that there'd been Black Tudors. They didn't know that there'd been people from Africa in Britain when Britain was a province of the Roman Empire. None of this was known to them. And it wasn't known because my profession, the historians, had utterly buried and marginalized and dismissed this history. That lack of knowledge about what the connections were to Britain, not just to the British Empire, but to Britain itself, that allowed people, because the people among the communities among whom they lived were equally ignorant of this history, it allowed them to be painted as aliens rather than British subjects, rather than people from islands that had been subject to England and then Britain's empire since the early 17th century. Instead, they were painted as aliens. Ignorance of one another's history is, I think, actively damaging. If I may briefly say, there's another example of how it's actively damaged, which is much more recent than 1948. I think, as a historian, the most, I think, heart-wrenching aspect of the Lessons Learned Review published after the Windrush scandal, and I should say there is, of course, now a scandal of the Windrush compensation scheme. To me, as an historian, the thing that struck me most was a line in Wendy Williams' report where she said that part of what made that scandal possible, part of what led to that appalling mistreatment of tens of thousands of our fellow citizens by the Home Office, by their own government, was not just a target-driven atmosphere. It was not just a neglect of the ways in which the laws passed after 2010 impacted amongst people who'd been in this country half an hour. Part of what made it possible was historical ignorance. People in the Home Office literally didn't understand the history of Britain, Britain's relationship to slavery, Britain's relationship to Africa, Britain's the histories of migration and movement. They didn't know, in a deep sense, who the people that they were mistreating, who they were. They didn't understand that if you're from Barbados, you've been part of England's sphere of influence since the 1620s. If you're from Jamaica, since the 1650s. They didn't understand who these elderly people sitting across them in a desk in offices in Croydon, they didn't know who they were. They didn't know that these are the descendants of people carried into slavery by ships that left this city, Bristol, 200 years ago. Ignorance of history in our own time, in the past few years, has literally destroyed the lives of tens of thousands of our fellow citizens. And I appeal for history because history is enriching, it's life enriching, it helps us to know each other. But we've just had a very powerful demonstration of the active danger of historical ignorance.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. Next question is, Fulham Palace was the home of the bishops of London from 704 to 1974. In 2022, Fulham Palace Trust commissioned an artist to take inspiration from the story of the Bishop of the Colonies, using the theme of resistance to bring a different lens to this story. What do you find of particular interest in the Bishop of London and the Church of England story? And what are your thoughts for how we might interpret this story in the future?
Of all the histories, all of the aspects of the story of slavery, there were two which I think really shock people, and they shock people in a very specific way. One of them is that people lived as enslaved people in Britain. Whenever I write about this, whenever I speak about this, I get messages on social media, I get people writing to my university to say it's not true. The idea that slavery took place here is something that there are people who just are not willing to accept that reality, despite the fact that we now have, thanks to a project at the University of Glasgow, 900 advertisements for the sale of black people on British streets and for the recapture of escaped black people on British streets. So that's one area that brings slavery too close, literally too close to home for some people. But another area is the involvement of the church in British slavery. It's an area, again, where people will want to try to pretend this doesn't happen. People will, again, want to rail against the facts, no matter how deep the historical evidence. And I think it sort of wrong-foots many people's idea of what slavery was. I think we're comfortable, or not comfortable, I think we're willing to accept that the slave owners were them, that they were this group, that they were this nouveau riche, that they were elite. But the idea that the establishment, the idea that the spiritual establishment was directly involved in British slavery, is something that's really challenging to many people. And in some ways what it shows is that the world of the church and the world of faith was involved in slavery in all sorts of ways, in good ways and bad ways. It was involved in the beginning of slavery, and it was involved in the end of slavery. It was involved in empowering enslaved people by giving them the power of those stories of the gospel, the stories of redemption, the stories of Pharaoh in Egypt, the stories of a search for Zion, of escape from Zion and a promised land. But it also produced catechisms that reinforced slavery. It also, not in the British case, but in the Dutch case and other cases, it used very old stories from the Bible partly in the British case, but much more common in the Dutch case, I should say, to justify the idea of hierarchies of races. So in some ways, the involvement of the church is in some ways just a reflection of the background society. The church was and is part of society, and its involvement in slavery took place, as societies did, in good and bad and troubling ways. So you have an organization in the Church of England that is directly complicit in owning Consett and Codrington plantations in Barbados, owning human beings. But you also have an organization that gets involved in all sorts of ways through all sorts of people in the abolitionist movement. Now, what shocks students of mine and people when they read this debate is that they struggle with the idea that people who are converts to abolitionism, powerful people in the church, particularly Bella Portiers, that they still talk in racial terms, and this is, we find, really difficult. We really struggle with this, that people could be anti-slavery, but they weren't anti-racist. These ideas of racial hierarchies were so powerful, and in some ways, getting over that is about maturity of understanding history. History doesn't allow us to have heroes, and people who want heroes from history have to ignore parts of the lives and legacies of the people they want to turn into heroes. And this is a really interesting and I think instructive place to say that. I think one of the most remarkable people in the story of abolition and slavery in Britain, somebody who was absolutely steeped in the church, someone who was profoundly religious, somebody who visited, we think, Fulham Palace, somebody who was involved with Porteous, was Granville Sharp. Granville Sharp's life is, if any life is one changed by a moral mission, it is Granville Sharp. He bumps in to a near dead enslaved boy, Jonathan Strong, in the middle of the 18th century, who's queuing outside his brother's a doctor, outside his surgery. And that encounter leads not just to an act of philanthropy, paying for the boy's care, getting him a job, rebuilding his life. When he is abducted by a former slave owner, it leads to a lifelong campaign against slavery. It leads Granville Sharp to become an expert on the legality or illegality of slavery in Britain. It leads to him forging a slightly disastrous but well-meaning colony in Africa itself. This becomes Granville Sharp's life. And yet Granville Sharp, from his letters, in a way that is disappointing but shouldn't be, because we should be more mature about this, believed in those myths about the hierarchies of races, those biblical myths of the sons of Noah and the sons of Ham. History never allows people or institutions to have a monotonal relationship with complicated issues. And part of the struggle to make Black history and the history of slavery and empire part of the mainstream narrative, as was said a moment ago. One of the reasons there's resistance to this, one of the reasons it's such a struggle, is because people are addicted to that idea of simplicity, of binary differences and oppositions, and of heroes. And we don't get that. We don't get that when it comes to slavery. We don't get it when it comes to empire. And we don't get it in the church the same as we don't get it in politics. People inside and outside the worlds of faith, their engagement with slavery are complicated. They're nuanced. All of the stories that you could say about someone like Granville Sharp or Porteous, you could say about William Wilberforce. Again, a man who's absolutely animated by his sense of faith. And it's very difficult for young students who presume, because they are the people of the 21st century, they presume that anti-slavery and anti-racism go hand in hand. They struggle to understand that people can be racist and anti-slavery. Again, it calls for maturity. These are nuanced histories. Everybody in Britain in the 19th century and the 18th century is a racist, but they're racists in different degrees and in different ways. And that struggle to understand this history in a nuanced and complicated way clashes with the simple binary oppositional heroic nature of history that we often demand in this country. The debates about statues is a classic example of that. People get furious discussing someone like Nelson. I think Nelson was one of the greatest military technicians of all time, though there were enormous technological reasons underpinning those strategies, which are often not talked about. But he was also absolutely a defender of the slave trade. He got married on a plantation. His family was involved in plantation slavery in the Caribbean. Both those things can be true. Someone can be a hero in a conflict and be complicit in one of the most evil things this country's ever been engaged in. History is not simple. And if you want history to tell you warm, fluffy stories that make you feel good, if it wants it to be a pageant of heroes and victories and glorious chapters, you're not engaging with history. You're engaging with a partial history, because you have to remove the nuance. And of all the subjects, and understanding the complexity of the seeming to us hypocrisy, almost schizophrenia of the church's relationship to slavery, is enormously complicated. And it becomes more complicated too when we go beyond the church and think about the Christian religion. If we think about some of the earliest people involved in slavery and the slave trade in Britain are the Quakers, who are also the people who absolutely launch the abolitionist movement of the 1880s. If we think about the great force that gives enslaved people a strength to resist, a strength in the case of Jamaica to rise up in the 1830s, it's the Baptist faith. So religion is all things, and faith plays different roles at different times, good and bad, complicated and nuanced, as does every institution in Britain. The Royal Navy defends the slave ships from the 17th century up until 1807. Then it spends a century off the coast of Africa fighting against the slave trade. If you want simplicity, this is the wrong history. You're not going to find it in the study of slavery and empire.
Thank you. Fascinating points. So we are speaking on Remembrance Day today and approaching Remembrance Sunday. Can you tell us a little more about some of the stories you've uncovered in relation to the role of Black people in both world wars?
Absolutely. My first love in history was the Second World War. I was brought up as a boy in the 1970s, which wasn't very long after the Second World War. I think it's something we sometimes forget. We think of the 60s and 70s as this world separated by eons from the Second World War. It was very recent. When I grew up, all the old men had fought in the Second World War. All the toys that boys played with toy soldiers, model aeroplanes, action men. So I was saturated in the story of the Second World War growing up. It was absolutely part of my childhood, and so I was obsessed with the Second World War. But I never presumed for a second that I would see Black people in the Second World War or the First World War, and that's because the toys I played with, the films I watched, the war movies that were always on television when I was growing up, they had written non-white people largely, almost entirely out of the story. I'll give you an example. That I have upstairs at home. I've got a box of soldiers. I managed to find a box like the ones I had growing up. I used them in a film, a documentary I made. The 8th Army, the British 8th Army, fought in the deserts of North Africa against Rommel and the Afrika Korps. I was obsessed with them as a kid. The box of soldiers has got a picture of 6 white soldiers on. And that's what I presumed as a child that the 8th Army had been. Why would I think anything otherwise? The British Eighth Army fighting the Germans. I presume they were all white. And that was the depiction in the war films, in the magazines. It was everywhere, except for the truth is it was the most diverse army Britain ever put together. It was consisted of men from all over India, from Sri Lanka, from what's now modern India, from Nepal, from Burma, from Pakistan. It consisted of men from Malta, men from North Africa, from men from across the British Empire. That image that was created after the Second World War, it really stuck, and it was really, really effective. And one of the reasons it was effective is because it had been done before, because it had been done to the First World War. Another, just as diverse and global a conflict, has been whitewashed, the black people removed. What's fascinating, and I think we need to remember, is this is not an act of forgetting. And it would be comforting to think this was just forgetting. Nations who'd lost hundreds of thousands of combat soldiers and sailors and airmen, and nations in mourning might understandably forget those who had fought in their forces from other countries. It's not a case of forgetting. There's some amnesia, but there's also a process of erasure. Let me give you an example. At the end of the Second World War, one of the key moments, one of the moments that was always going to be imprinted in history, was the liberation of Paris. And the Allies, when they were planning how this was going to be done, how this was going to be filmed, how this moment would be presented to the world, this absolute landmark, recovering the city that had been under the jackboot of the German army for 5 years. They decided that the Free French Army, the army that of French soldiers who had not been captured in 1940, that had fought throughout the war, that they would lead the conquest of Paris, that they would be the people who would be on the newsreels. And if you look at the newsreels, you see these tanks coming in with these French soldiers and the Free French flag. But what you see is a distortion, because 60% of the Free French Army were not white. There were black soldiers and there were North African soldiers. The reason for this, quite simply, was that these were the units of the French army not in France in 1940, because they were colonial units. And what happened was the British and the Americans and the French insisted that those black and brown soldiers, North African and South African, Southern African, Sub-Saharan African, that they were removed from those units that liberated Paris. They were literally stripped of their uniforms and locked into barracks. So at the moment when we could see the reality of the Second World War, we could see the soldiers from Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire on the tanks coming into Paris, that we could see the role that they had played throughout the war. The majority of the Free French Army. What we got instead was a lie. We got a distortion. This French army was said to be all white. And in fact, they couldn't find enough white soldiers. So they selected the most light-skinned of the North African soldiers and included them and hoped no one would notice. So this is not forgetting. This is amnesia. And we see it again at the end of the First World War. At the end of the First World War, there's a series of what's called peace parades, which are really victory marches. There's one in Paris and there's one in London. The one in Paris, the African-American soldiers who had fought in the French army, 2 regiments, the 368th, 369th Infantry Regiments, the Harlem Hellfighters, as they were called, were not allowed to march under the Champs-Élysées, under the Arc de Triomphe. The Americans insisted that their own black soldiers didn't take part. And that in the march in Britain, Indian soldiers were allowed to take part, but African soldiers and Caribbean soldiers were not. So when there was requests that the West African Frontier Force soldiers from Nigeria and Ghana, my ancestors, that they be shipped to London to take part in this event, which took place well a year after the war, it was rejected. So at those moments when we could imprint on the historical record the diversity of those conflicts, political leaders chose to do the opposite. They chose to imprint on the historical record, often the filmic record, a falsehood, a monoclonal all-white conflict. And that's because what these conflicts demanded was that they suspended the laws of race, that they created these incredible multinational, multiracial, multi-faith armies. We think that the Western Front, by 1916, 1917, and particularly the area behind the front lines that included the laborers, the supplies, the munitions factories, we think that was probably the most diverse place that had ever existed in human history, because everybody came. We think 4 million non-white people took part in the First World War, either as soldiers or auxiliaries or munitions workers. And that world behind the lines was just astonishing. And there are hundreds, thousands of photographs and films. And even countries that weren't combatants in the First World War took part. China sent 140,000 Chinese laborers who came to the Western Front. Many of them were employed by the British, and they were employed in a tank warehouse, a tank factory, where tanks were maintained. They were very primitive vehicles. They needed a huge amount of maintenance, and that was done by the Chinese Labour Corps. So the Battle of the Somme, the Battle of Ancre, the Battle of Cambrai, the great battles that involved tanks, this wonder weapon of the First World War, the people who had got them ready to go to the front lines, to be carried on trains, to be taken part, were Chinese laborers. There's a place called Noyelles-du-Somme in northern France, which is a Chinese cemetery with thousands of headstones with Chinese characters and Chinese dragons at the doorway. That's not the image of the First World War that I was taught at school. It's not the image of the First World War that is imprinted on the books that I read. And yet it is the image that people who lived through the First World War knew, because it was such an exotic thing that the newspapers were obsessed with it. It was always reported at the time. It was a very easy feature to write, because this was a very difficult war to report. The incredible spectacle of cavalry regiments from the Deccan Plain of India, soldiers and pilots from what's now Thailand, the Siamese contingent who came over. The journalists flocked to these stories. What happened was, as the war came to an end, there was an editing out and a rewriting of history, and that's a tragedy in lots of ways, because again, these are about shared histories. I think it's remarkable that we can tell young Indian, Pakistani children, British Pakistani, British Indian children, Bangladeshi children, that their ancestors fought in the First World War. That children whose ancestors came from the Caribbean could learn about the British West Indies Regiment. That Nigerian Ghanaian kids could learn about the West African Frontier Force. We have these areas of history which are inclusive, and yet we've made them monochrome and non-exclusive. We need to reframe our understanding of the First World War, and something similar is happening in France. France's army was even more diverse, and France is doing better than Britain in recognizing that the First World War is not just this great shared tragedy, it's a great opportunity to remind ourselves that our interconnections, those of us who live in these hyper-diverse societies, they're actually deeper than we think. It's not just empire, it's not just slavery. It is much more recent histories. It's much more surprising histories. And these stories are incredibly valuable, incredibly remarkable in all sorts of ways. And it's just a better story. The First World War is more interesting. And, we're not the first people to work this out. As I said, the journalists at the time knew that this was interesting. But what's really disheartening is there are people who don't feel this way about these new revelations, this uncovering of this deliberately erased diverse history. The reaction to the film 1917, which entirely accurately included an Indian soldier and a soldier of African heritage, the hysterical reaction by people who know nothing of this history, who presumed it was political correctness, who dismissed it as tokenism without any knowledge that the Western Front was a quarter held by Indian soldiers at the end of 1914, that the first British offensive of the war, the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle, the majority of the attackers were from India. People with no knowledge of this, but belief in what the First World War looked like. When filmmakers get it right, they accuse them of political bias, and that's a worrying trend, and that needs to be absolutely fought against.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely amazing. Thank you. And I just know the power of teaching the history, including Black soldiers, Asian soldiers. We did that at our school, and the children, they just couldn't believe it. Showing some of the photos, basically from your book, to be quite honest, one of the photos, and for them, straight away, there was that buy-in, because they could see themselves in it, and they could see that actually, my goodness, did my ancestors fight in the First World War? And for them, it was a great opening, and they were more engaged. And I think
Well,
that's how we get our children engaged in history, because they can.
I'm planning and hoping. I think over the next year and a half, 18 months, the plan is to do a children's version of that book.
Perfect. Right. I do have some questions for you. So I've got one question here, and it says, well, hi, Professor Olusoga. I've recently started a PhD focusing on Black histories in understudied areas of Britain. And my research will start in Cornwall, as I've spent a number of years working in the archives there. I wonder if you have any thoughts on the importance of researching Black histories in rural areas, particularly in areas that today are predominantly white.
Yeah. I think one of the dangers of Black history is that, we have to fight for every source, every mention, every picture, every image, every document. And that leads us naturally to some biases. Much of this history took place in London, and it's easy to write a Black history of London. But that would only ever give us part of the story. The 18th century Black population, of which we have such a vivid picture, is predominantly male. We think maybe 80% male, and yet we mustn't allow ourselves to create histories that are male histories in which female voices are lost. So those directions in which the archive could push us, if we don't dig deeper, if we don't resist it, absolutely need to be fought against. And that idea that this is a London story or this is an urban story, that this is really Bristol, Liverpool and London, I think is something that's being sort of brilliantly contested all over the place, not just in rural histories. What's happening in Scotland with this very blatant recognition of Scotland's involvement in slavery and the advent of black Scottish populations really from the 16th century onwards. I think that's really heartening. Something similar is happening in Ireland. I was talking to a brilliant Irish academic just this week who's launching an enormous project to look at the black presence in Ireland and Ireland's involvement in slavery and Ireland's involvement in abolition and the ways in which that was seen through the prism of Ireland's own political struggles against English power. So it's like we've built this island on which we stand. We knew nothing. We've established this bridgehead. We've drawn everything we can so far out of the archives. Well, now is the time that we can stand on that firm ground and start expanding it, because we don't know enough about the presence of Black people in the non-English nations. We don't know enough outside of the metropolis. We don't know enough outside of the provincial cities. So I think it's absolutely fundamental to do. And again, the range of stories that you find if you go outside of the urban spaces is astonishing. You find, if you go to rural Wales, you find people who are living as isolated servants in country houses. Same in parts of England. But you also get people who are living in ports. Anywhere that is connected to the empire of the sea, this kind of world, in many ways, hyper diverse world of the merchant navy and also the Royal Navy in many points in its history. Again, you see diverse people living in ways that are not like those of London. So I see this as an expansion, and I'm very pleased to hear about your work, and as an expansion of the field, of a widening of our vision and enriching of the picture.
Thank you. There's one other question here, and it says, Professor, I saw you had an interesting discussion with Professor Addy about the role of Black History Month at the British Library some time ago. Some seem to argue that with Black History 365 embedded in history, basically, we don't need Black History Months. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's a real risk that and I disagree with Professor Addy here quite strongly, is that we throw away something which is one of the greatest achievements of the Black British population. We are 3.3% of this country. The history that we now celebrate was buried. It just wasn't there. It wasn't there until Lawrence Shylon and Jim Walvin started writing their books in the 60s. It wasn't publicly available until Peter Fryer published Staying Power in the middle of the 1980s, 1984. And even when it was available, no one knew about it. When I grew up, the word Windrush meant absolutely nothing. Now everybody knows what it means for good and for some bad reasons. And we've done that through Black History Month. We've taken this American format and we have made it part of the culture, part of the calendar of thousands and thousands of companies, corporations, universities, schools, charities, and institutions of every sort. It is an astonishing achievement. Now, when I talk to people who work in, I'm involved in charities about modern day slavery. I have friends who are involved in disability campaigning. And what they say to me is, God, I wish we had something like Black History Month. And yet I often hear people say this thing, which, and this is my challenge to Professor Addy, I don't think there's any evidence for this. And I every time I have this debate, I say, well, show me some evidence. The idea is that Black History Month traps Black history into 1 month of the year and prevents it from being out in the rest of the year. There is no evidence for this. We know when people watch things on television, because every time you log onto the iPlayer or Disney Plus or Amazon, it tells us. We know when people access websites because everything is monitored. There's metadata. And we know when people buy books. And they don't just do it in October. There is no world in which people close the book on the 1st of November or open it on the last day of September. The biggest time that the peak of purchasing books on Black British history and on race is, like it is for every form of publishing, Christmas, not October. People are watching these films, these programs all over the year. Bridgerton, the biggest success on Netflix, has got no metrics that tie it to October. Black History Month isn't imprisoning Black history in 1 month of the year. It supercharges it for 1 month of the year. And people I know who work in other areas, when they hear these arguments against it, they think we have lost our minds. They think you've created against the odds. You've got this American format, you made it British. There's lots of things about Black history that always needed to be better. It needed to be less American and more British. That's happening now. It's a brilliant success story. And I think there's danger of talking it down, of making claims that have no metrics behind them, no evidence. I've never sat on a panel where anyone has been able to point to any evidence that says this thing actually happens. And the other thing is, I've never heard anyone say this about International Women's Day or Holocaust Remembrance Day. I've never heard anyone say this about any other organization, any other movement, any other group that uses a day to speak about, or a month to speak about its history. Don't say it about St. Patrick's Day. I think it's one of those things that sounds deep, and yet there's no evidence for it. And I think the problem is we're confusing two problems. Black History Month is a brilliant tool for us to make our history part of the mainstream story. The reason Black history is out there is not because of Black History Month. It's because of centuries of erasure. It's because of the resistance of a government that would rather play culture war games with our history and our shared stories. Black History Month isn't the problem. It's part of the solution. The problem is racist institutions and politicians who want to play culture war games with our history, and people who don't care about creating a history that actually speaks to the reality of our country. It is a very strange thing to blame the need for more history, the integration of Black history, on one of the most powerful tools we've ever stumbled across for making Black history. Every Black History Month, hundreds of thousands, millions of children engage with histories that otherwise they might not. People in organizations attend talks and lectures and sent emails or magazines that they wouldn't have encountered. The idea of not having that, and not having it because of a claim that has no evidence behind it, that would be an act of self-harm. And we have enough people who've traditionally wanted to harm us without us joining the queue. So I think Professor Addy is entirely wrong. I admire his work. I've known him for 20 years. But again, I challenge him and I challenge others. Where's the evidence? Where is the evidence that Black History Month has the effect that people claim?
I agree with that totally. We talk about that, and we talk about history, Black History Months, as if you compare it to, say, for example, talking about Christianity or religion, talking about Christianity. And we can talk about Christianity all year long, but the time that we really talk about it is Christmas, and it's the same thing. So it's exactly the same thing. It's Black history is throughout the year, but it's that, as you said, that supercharge in the month of October, and that's exactly how it should be looked at. Great, thank you. I'm going to go over to Kate because I know we've got some questions in the chat. So Kate, if you want to put forward 1 or 2 questions, and I've got 1 left, but I think it's good if we can have at least a question from the chat.
Thank you very much, Rosie. So people have been commenting some really thoughtful and interesting opinions in the chat. So I would recommend people have a look at those comments because they're really interesting. But I know we had a question that I think was quite interesting, looking at why don't we hear more about post-abolition indentured labourers and where can we find their stories?
Well, I am the only producer in the history of the BBC to have made a documentary about indentured labour. It's called Coolies: How the British Reinvented Slavery, and it's on YouTube. And I made it 20 years ago with Professor David Dabadine from Guyana. And I'm making a series at the moment about the British Empire. And again, we're telling the story of indenture, and we go to the docks in Calcutta from which indentured laborers were imported. But we also, there's another history we don't tell. We don't tell the story of indenture within India. And in some ways, that's the biggest story. The British in the last quarter of the 18th century finally find a way of removing one of the great problems they'd had ever since the 18th century, which is they were addicted to tea and they didn't want to have to pay the Chinese silver for it. They solved that problem initially by dumping opium grown in India on India and making the British Empire the biggest drug pusher in history. But they finally solved the problem by growing tea in India, in Assam and other regions, but the indigenous populations would not grow it for them. And so they imported people from the traditional indentured labour areas in a middle passage that was, according to some historians, as deadly as the middle passage of the Atlantic crossing, to create tea plantations in Assam and other areas. And today in India, there are around 5 million people who are called the tea tribes of India. They are displaced people. They are people who are not part of the local communities, who are looked down upon in many cases, and they are there because of a brief economic opportunity in the late 19th century for the British to outmaneuver the Chinese in the tea industry. So indenture is absolutely fundamental. I think the reason we don't talk about it is because we don't talk about anything to do with the empire. Slavery has become one of the few things that's forced itself onto the agenda. And what's following it is all of these other histories we don't talk about. We don't talk about the extermination of the people of the Caribbean islands on which slavery, the slave states were built. We don't talk about the indentured labor that followed. We don't talk about the destruction of the independent economic forms of life that the former enslaved people tried to create in islands like Jamaica that was brutally suppressed by the British, who were addicted to racial ideas about indolence and laziness. So we don't speak about any of it. It's been forgotten because so much of that history, because we are a very strange country. We built the biggest empire the world had ever seen. We still like to remember its size, but we don't want to know its details. It's a very strange position. We want to remember it happened, but we don't want to think about the ways in which it changed us and changed our relationship with the world. But what's happening, and what I think is heartening, is that those former colonies are themselves reminding people in this country that this is a shared history. Again, it's the issue is a shared history. We can't have a monologue about this history, and we can't pretend it didn't happen, because literally 2 billion people are part of Britain's history, because this is the effect. This is the long-term residue of having the biggest empire on earth. And those nations are demanding to talk about it. And I think we saw that with the disastrous tour of the Caribbean by the future King William and his wife Kate. We can't go to the Caribbean and not talk about slavery anymore. You can't talk to India about, you can't have a coronation next year and not discuss the Koh-i-Noor diamond that rests in the British crown. The days of pretending the empire didn't happen and the idea that we can control the monologue rather than have a dialogue, those days are crashing to an end.
Thank you. So I think we just have one more question from the chat. So Juliana asks, is there any historical evidence of the African communities that were pillaged as part of the Atlantic slave trade and how they rebuilt their worlds?
It's an enormously mixed picture. Some of those communities were slave trading communities. Some of them were victims of the slave trade, and we have this world of resistance and collaboration, of involvement and revolution against. in some ways, the story of the rebuilding after the slave trade coalesces with the story of the Europeans building their empires. So there is not a period in which Africa has a breath between the end of the Atlantic slave trade and the beginning of the Age of Empire. They merge into one another. So there isn't a moment of so much, well, there is rebuilding and there's reconstruction and there's constitution of new societies, but there's also the coming of the Europeans who can, for the first time since their contact with Africa, because of new medical and military innovations, can actually live and occupy Africa. So these two things merge into one another. The age of slavery and the age of empire fold upon one another.
Thank you. Rosie, did you want to ask one last question?
Yes, I've got one last question. There's two actually, but we'll see if we can have the second one. Hammersmith and Fulham has taken the lead in embedding Black history, not just in education, but in everyday life too. From your vantage point, what do you think are the vital things to think about in continuing the work in making Black history more embedded? And the last bit, what do you think are the key things to think about in relation to this question in 2023?
Yeah, I have a very clear view on this point. We have rightly and understandably focused upon the incredible lives that have been dragged out of the darkness of erasure and into our consciousness. This history of the Black presence in Britain gives us remarkable people: Uluda Equiano, Mary Prince, Mary Seacole, Sarah Forbes-Mineta. We need to get to know these people. We need to appreciate them as great Britons, which is what they really were. The problem is that Black history can not only be that. It has to also be the involvement of Africa and Africans, people of African descent who never set foot in Britain. Britain's history is imperial, and Britain's relationship with Africa and Africans is imperial. It takes place in Britain, it takes place in the Caribbean, and it takes place in Africa. And we need to make this history imperial. And that means recognizing the ways in which British history was shaped by Black people who never set foot here. The classic example, the one that I talk about all the time, is the Industrial Revolution. The capital for the Industrial Revolution partly comes from slavery and the slave trade. After Britain's exit from the slave trade, Britain's industrial boom, is made possible in part by slave-produced cotton that comes from the American South. The idea that the Industrial Revolution is this part of legitimate British history and Black history is just about the Black people who lived in Britain, that misses that story. 2 million African Americans produced the cotton for the British Industrial Revolution. 1 in 5 people in the 1850s, according to The Economist magazine, were to some extent financially dependent upon the cotton industry. And that cotton, the vast majority of it, sometimes 80-90%, came from the Deep South. Those almost 2 million Black people never set foot on Britain, but they're part of British history. So we need to expand it from biography and to understand that Black people in Africa, Black people in America, Black people who never set foot on British soil are also part of this history.
Perfect, thank you. There's one last question. I don't know if we've got time, Kate, for the final question. And it's, can you tell us a little bit about your programme that's going to take place on Sunday on the BBC?
Yeah, it's about the history of Covent Garden. We often get the date of Covent Garden wrong, because Covent Garden looks like a lot of London, but that's because a lot of London was copied from Covent Garden. It's not an 18th century square, which is what people often presume. It was built in the 1630s. It was built before the Civil War. It's the first purpose-built piazza in Britain. And the reason that the program has come about, because for many years I've been obsessed with a painting produced in the 1650s by a guy called Samuel Scott, who's sometimes called Britain's Canaletto. He produced beautiful landscapes of London, and he painted from his studio window, which was in Covent Garden, and that painting is a snapshot of mid-18th century Covent Garden. It is obviously Covent Garden. It is just the buildings are the same, even though many of them are actually being rebuilt since. And he paints this diorama of the people of Covent Garden. We see the prostitutes who were listed in Harris's book of Covent Garden ladies. We see the market traders. We see the people from the Ottoman Empire who'd come to live nearby. It was a very diverse place then and now. We see an enslaved boy of African heritage in his liveries, like those enslaved boys we see in thousands of 18th century paintings. So I think Covent Garden is one of those places where, despite the best efforts of the rich, they could never keep everybody out. And it became a place of encounter, a place where people of different classes and races and identities were always able to find a way of being together. So, and it's also a slightly odd program because we're using new technology. So, I can't really describe the new technology. It might work, it might not. You'll have to tell me next time I'm with you whether it works. But it's a great story, and I hope you like it.
Really looking forward to it. Really looking forward to it. I think that's our final question. It's over to you, Kate, just to, but thank you so much. It's been fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie.
Thank you so much, Professor Olusoga. So before we go, we just wanted to highlight a few other exciting events that we've got coming up across the borough. So on Saturday, the 26th of November, there will be an unveiling for a new sculpture of Fanny Eaton from 1:15 at 2 Bassin Park Road, which is off Askew Road, to commemorate the life of Fanny Eaton, who was a model for the Pre-Raphaelites. In attendance will be members of Fanny Eaton's family, the Nubian Jack Community Trust and Kite Studios, who own the building. To coincide with the release of Black Panther 2, schools will be displaying the work that they have done around African kingdoms at Riverside Studios from Wednesday, the 30th of November. On Friday, the 9th of December, Bonnie Greer, who visited one of the schools in the borough recently, will be at the British Museum running an event. And in February 2023, Fulham Palace will be launching the exhibition which will be showing the work of students and community groups who have been creating work with spoken word artist Adisa as they explore the themes of hidden resistance in the Caribbean. And finally, we just want to say a big thank you to Gavin Bennett and Peter Parkin from Hammersmith and Fulham, and Rosie Peters from Wendell Park School for all the amazing work that they're doing to promote Black history in the borough for schools and the community, and also for supporting this talk. Thank you to the Arts Council England for supporting Fulham Palace Trust to deliver its artist-led project, focusing on the story of the Bishop of London, colonialism, and the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans. And finally, a huge thank you to Professor Olusoga for his really inspiring session tonight. And thank you to the audience for your really thoughtful comments and questions.